Chats with Champions, presented by Skidompha Library and sponsored by the First Bank of Damariscotta on Main Street, celebrating its 150th anniversary with 16 branches along the coast. Our next chat will be on January 15th with John Ford and Mark Nickerson, Maine Warden and Trooper. We hope you'll all come for that chat as well. At this time, I'd like to remind you to turn off or silence any electric devices, please. And I would like to thank Mal Gormley, our videographer, for doing the tape this morning of our chat. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Reza Jalali, writer, playwright, educator, Muslim scholar, a prominently recognized ethnic American in Making It in America, a source book on eminent ethnic Americans. Originally occurred from Iran, Mr. Jalali is a human rights and refugee activist who has lived in Maine since 1985. Excuse my voice. He wrote the foreword to New Mainers, a book on immigrant experiences in Maine, which you'll see on the front table up here. His children's book, Moon Watchers, also on the front table, received a Skipping Stones Honor Award for a multicultural book. Homesick, Mosque, and Other Stories, Mr. Jalali's short story collection, was published in 2013. His play, The Poets and the Assassin, about women in Iran and Islam, has been staged at Bates and Bowdoin Colleges and the University of Southern Maine and the University of New England. Mr. Jalali has taught at the Bangor Theological Seminary, has also been an adjunct faculty member, or is, are you?
I am.
Now, at the University of Southern Maine, and coordinates the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs at the University of Southern Maine. He is the Muslim advisor at Bowdoin College, a position he previously held at Bates College. In 1992, he visited the White House as part of a national delegation to discuss the plight of Kurdish refugees fleeing Iraq. Today, he will speak on this topic, Our Immigrant Neighbors, and will share passages from his books, some of which will be for sale up on the table after the talk. Please join me in welcoming Reza Jalali.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your kind words. In case you're wondering how I get to do all these wonderful things in life, the simplest explanation is I don't have a life. And thank you again. Very kind of you. So this is going to be an informal conversation about our new neighbors. Can you all hear me way back? And so please stop me with questions if you have any. And in between, I'll read a few passages from these two different books, which describe the lives of our new neighbors. I don't have to tell you that Maine, which is a graying state with 0 to negative in terms of population rate, needs immigrants more than any other state. In fact, here we are in Lincoln, a county which has the oldest population in the country, I understand. And the arrival of immigrants in Maine in search of safety, human dignity, in some cases for better economical opportunities, to access higher education, among other reasons, adventure, love, you name it. There are all kinds of reasons why immigrants come here. It's not a new story. As an advocate for these communities and as a person who came to Maine 29 years ago as a displaced person, as a refugee, I can tell you that this is a a natural continuation of what happened centuries ago. The arrival of those before us, the Jewish who escaped the Holocaust in Europe, the Armenians, the Greeks, the Italians, the Irish, the French Canadians, the Germans. The list goes on and on. All those who came before us, and the same process continues. The only difference is that today in Lewiston, Maine, in the same classrooms with the French Canadian children were learning English because their parents came here in search of better life to work in the mills. Now we have the Somalis who are coming here for the same reasons. And the children are learning English. And the same classrooms are being crowded once again with children of immigrants. What is strange is defending this reality to a nation of immigrants, because all of us, at one time or the other, have arrived here, some by choice, some were brought here as slaves, and some came in search of safety and security. But we all are immigrants. And unless you belong to an indigenous and Native American tribe from Maine, we all are kind of from far away. We've just come at different times of history. And the story of immigrants or people moving from one place to another is as ancient, as old as history itself. That at one time or the other, people have packed up to leave what was their home, to go to a different place for the sake of better life, either for themselves or their children or their children's children. Maine, as the southern part of the state now, is home to some 30,000 immigrants, people that we call New Mainers, and that's why we came up with the title for this book that a friend of mine and I co-authored. We were getting tired of the titles that most of us had for these communities. Some call them refugees, some still do, some call them Somalis, Africans, immigrants. And we felt that none of these really titles did justice, because most of them, well, legally speaking, they were no longer refugees. The moment that you arrive in this country, your status changes and you become a legal alien or a permanent resident. These are the legal terms, but you're no longer a refugee. The refugee status only applies when you're in transition between your country of birth, the second country where you sought asylum, and the country of settlement, which in this case would be the United States. And we decided to call them New Mainers. We argued that these are people who are not going anywhere. They have arrived here. They're starting to call Maine home, establishing roots. And regardless of our feelings, whether we liked it or not, the reality is that they are our neighbors, unlike the Canadian tourists, some who come here and leave by beginning of September. Members of these communities are here for good. And we thought the sooner we get to know them, hear the stories, learn about them, who they are, why they come here, how they're doing in the new life, would be better for all of us. So we decided to write this book, and in the process of writing the book, we discovered some wonderful facts. I had always assumed that most New Mainers who call Maine home had come here as refugees. We found out that almost 2/3 of them had come as immigrants. And if you read the book, you would discover the stories of some 29 New Mainers. And you find out that, again, some have come for higher education, some had come to work, and some had come as refugees. I'll offer a few examples, very brief examples. we have a case of a young woman from Turkey, and Zeynep Turk. She finished high school in Istanbul, Turkey, a mega city, if some of you have been there. It's a large city of some 13, 14 million people, with some parts of Europe and some parts of Asia. A city that never goes to sleep, almost like New York City. And she went to high school and she decided to continue education in the United States. She applied to a number of colleges, she got accepted in a few, and the school that she decided to attend was in Machias. Nothing against Machias, but that is my first question, that Istanbul, Machias, how did you okay? And she told me she loved it. She loved being in Machias, that this gave her an opportunity to focus on her studies. And, well, I was worried about the nightlife there, but that people were very, very kind and accepting of her. And so you have this young woman from Istanbul, Turkey, studying in Machias for her undergraduate degree. She graduates. She has every intention to go back to Turkey to use her new degree to work. And then she decides to go to University of Maine in Orono for her master's, for her MBA. And once she graduates from UMO, she decides again to go back to Europe, to Turkey perhaps, to work as a banker or for the insurance or banking industry. And a large bank in Maine, Maine-based bank, approached her and said, why don't you work for us for a few years? Long story short, that was some 15, 20 years ago. She's now a citizen in this country. She's purchased a home in Maine, and she works for the Maine Trade Commission. And I love this about her, that now she gets to go across the world to promote Maine and what is made in Maine. And but we have also similar stories, like doctors who have arrived here, foreign-born doctors, foreign-born engineers. We have the story of a Chinese scientist who works for Fairchild or National Semiconductor. That company keeps changing owners and names. He has patents named after him. He can live anywhere in the world. And when I went to talk to him, to interview him with my friend, we said, why Maine? He said, why not? And we thought, he's a very smart man. Basically, he really challenged us to give him reasons why other places, and we had nothing to say to that. And but we're also doing the same interview just to make the story interesting. We found out that his mother and his mother-in-law also were living with them. His own mother and his wife's mother were living under the same roof, and we asked him, we said, is there any conflict? How are things going? Smiled and said, well, they don't speak each other's languages. It seemed that they spoke different dialects of China, and he's from Hong Kong, and the wife is from mainland China. And so there are always stories of immigrants who arrived in Maine, who have made our lives much richer, who are contributing to the local economy. Some of them are creating jobs, and then every now and then we hear the tiring old cliche that immigrants come here to receive welfare and they're a burden on the society. Do some of them receive welfare? Absolutely. Some of them need that initial support. Some of them stay longer than others on welfare. And I, for one, as a taxpayer, I'm glad that we are a caring state, that we do have a safety network to help people, to help our own fellow human beings, our own neighbors, who for one reason or the other need the help. But do all of them come here to receive welfare? Absolutely not. It's hard for me to imagine that a person starts from a village in Africa, somewhere in Asia, crosses hostile lands, hostile borders, oceans, mountains to make it to Maine, to make it to the United States, just to stand on welfare line. It takes so much courage to leave everything which is familiar behind, to leave your community behind, and come to this land to learn a new language, to start a brand new life without any family support. And I just have a hard time believing that they would do that for welfare. They have a dream. They have a dream to come here so that the children would have a better life. And try telling that to a Vietnamese family who works 6 to 7 days a week running a store in Portland. No vacation. They don't have the means to go to an expensive restaurant to eat. And they work hard, 12 hours a day sometimes, so that they would gain a piece of the American dream. I mean, in their case, it might be a house, it might be higher education for their children, it might be a brand new Lexus. But this is their American dream. Try telling these that have come here to receive welfare to a Bosnian mother, herself a victim of a rape victim, who has escaped the horror of Balkan wars to make it here, who works at a chicken factory or a fish cleaning place on Commercial Street in Portland, no sick time, no vacation time, minimum wage. With some God-given courage, she gets up every morning, despite the dark nightmares that she has about her past in Bosnia, that she wakes up 5 in the morning every morning, 5 days a week, to go to work, 10 hours shift, so that her daughters would not be judged because of their gender, but because of their character, that they would have good education, that they would enjoy the safety that in Maine we are fortunate to have and offer our neighbors. So there are of course, every now and then there's xenophobia of the dislike of foreigners, and the other, capital O, surface in this estate, as it does across the country, that who are they? They're a burden. Why do they come to Lewiston, Maine? Well, in case of Lewiston, Maine, the arrival of Somali refugees and immigrants have really been quite positive for that community. This is a town which was dying. There were very few young people, hardly any businesses starting. The schools were at risk of being closed down for lack of students. And then we have the arrival of these families with young children. And the classrooms get crowded once again. The downtown area, which most of the stores used to be closed, boarded up, saw a new life. We have so many stores owned and run by Somalis, who are selling food items, restaurants, clothing items, and also the landlords started to fix the buildings. They saw the potential. They started to fix the old buildings and rehab them, to rent them to the new members of the community. So, and of course, the federal money follows refugees, and so millions of dollars have come because of the new arrivals in Lewiston area and in Portland, Maine. So I can go on and talk about, this is one of my favorite subjects, as you can imagine, that the arrival of immigrants in Maine as a growing state, as a state which is getting older and older, is tremendous opportunity for us. And this is not about whether we like them or not. This is not about we have to keep hugging them and telling them welcome and thank you and love them. And that would be nice too. I wouldn't ask you not to do that. But this is really about our future. This is about our future as a state, as a community, that we need young people, we need skilled workforce, we need educated workforce. I'm fortunate to work for a public university which is struggling with enrollment because Maine is graduating fewer and fewer high school students. And those who graduate tend to go out of state to study, and they go out of state, we understand, in part because in search of diversity, they want to go and see the world. The world has changed. And here, in our own university, we're seeing an increasing number of immigrant and children of immigrant coming to access higher education and enrolling in our classes, and that's again good news for us. We need more of them. I am going to stop here and read an excerpt from my own story, how I ended up in Maine, and then we'll of course come back to the story of immigrants in Maine again and again today in terms of questions, or I'll make more remarks. But let me read a few paragraphs from the foreword to New Mainers. In my extended family, there is a tale going back to my childhood in Kurdistan, Iran. Like many good stories, it begins with a knock at the door. My mother carried me, the youngest of the 9 children, answers it to find a group of singing gypsy women. One of them offers to tell her fortune in exchange for money. Curious, Khanum, as we call mother, stretches one hand out while holding onto me tight, for the common myth was that gypsies snatched city babies to raise them as their own. The gypsy loses interest in reading Khanum's palm and instead peeks at my face and sighs. Oh, your baby shall drink much water in strange lands, the woman says in her broken Farsi, her face turning pale, for she knows such news could mean less reward. Upset on hearing, her youngest child might move to a faraway land to live among strangers, Khanum curses the unfortunate woman and throws some change at her before shutting the door. Still grasping me, she weeps, unmoved by my grandmother's pleas, with tears of such bitterness would sour her breast milk. Growing up in a small town on the border of Iran and Iraq, Qasr Shirin, the Palace of Shirin, named so in honor of the tragic love affair of the Armenian queen Shirin and a poor stone-cutter Farhad, I heard the story of the gypsies' visit again and again. Yet every time I listened to this family tale, I felt a fresh sadness, as heavy as the nearby mountains where the stonecutter had hacked at the rocks day and night to show his unfulfilled love for the beautiful queen. So I'm growing up in Iran, in this dusty village on the border of Iran and Iraq, and soon the secret police of the Shah of Iran, Sawak, was arresting and jailing Iranian young men and women, in particular the Kurds, a social minority group inside Iran, and I'm a Kurd, as you heard during the introduction. So my family feared for my physical safety, and they encouraged me to go to India to continue my education. So I moved to India and to continue my education, but thinking that well, I'll go back to Iran after I was done my education. That I have lived outside of, but then of course I never got to go back to Iran. I became a displaced person and came here as a refugee. that I have lived outside of Kurdistan for more than 30 years, never to return save a few brief visits, is a reminder of life's cruelty. Robert Frost said that every poem begins with a knot in the throat. So does describing a life spent in exile, voluntarily or not, the loneliness of life among the unfamiliar, survival in the no man's land, the in-betweenness, the search for identity, and the regret one feels when remembering home. Displaced people and other immigrants live a life marked by longing for belonging, and a faint hope, fading as time passes, that one day the return to home, quote unquote, will become a possibility. Years after my mother passed away, I wrote of her longing as a refugee, displaced in her own country in an essay for the Maine Sunday Telegram. And I quote, "Recently, my mother had started to wear a key around her neck. It was a key to our ancestors' house, which was lost and ultimately destroyed during the long Iran-Iraq war. She wore the key to remind herself and the rest of us what we had lost to the war. I suspected in her case, just like the Jewish shopkeeper forced out of Poland, or the Palestinian farmer chased away from his ancestral home, holding the key to a past which no longer existed was to stay connected, however remotely, to that forgotten and former world." So while I'm in India, there's a revolution, the so-called Islamic Revolution of 1979. And practically, I've become a displaced person, a stateless person at a young age. And to make things more complicated, the Iran-Iraq war starts, which went on for 8 years. Started in 1980 and ended in 1988. And all this time, I had to live in exile, and I realized I could not go back to Iran. So I applied for refugee status in India, and I'm accepted as a refugee, and then I moved to the United States and to Portland, Maine. And this part is about my coming to Maine, to my new home. Once I got to Portland, my new home, it felt like a sweet dream. To my tired eyes, the electric lights seemed brighter, and the sky looked bluer. I would walk around penniless, single and without a friend, enjoying the new sights and sounds. With the curiosity of a lost traveler, I would watch people around me. My eyes would light up like a baby's when I caught the glimpse of the ocean. Lost in the narrow streets of the city's west end, I would stop to admire the magically fragrant lilac bushes leaning over the fences. Open-mouthed and with my head tilted back, I would chase with my eyes the birds whose English names I was yet to learn as they took flight into the New England sky. Feeling alive with excitement, I would marvel at the openness with which pretty women flirted with me. At times like these, I felt, after years of searching, I found a home. If leaving one's home is like a death, settling down in a new country is like a rebirth. Like a baby, one learns by watching others, making mistakes, crying and laughing when provoked. It took me a while to realize not every gaze was friendly. Although, I must admit, I was a sight to stare at. Though most people around me dressed in shorts and t-shirts, bearing pale flesh, I was dressed in layers of sweaters. From Maine's early June temperature of low 60s felt intolerably cold compared to India's heat. See, I'd come from India. Weeks later, as I walked down Congress Street, gazing into store windows and walking inside just to look at the merchandise, I felt unwelcome. At one clothing store known for its low prices, I was followed around by the unfriendly store manager. When I pretended to be interested in a fleece jacket, he wanted to know if I could afford it. For a long time afterwards, every time I passed that store, I had a maddening urge to throw a rock through its plate glass windows. But I did not do that, I promise you, in case you wonder. Though I'd come to accept the fact that most New Englanders were aloof, I still felt sad whenever a pair of cold eyes stared at me as if questioning my right to be here in Maine. Soon doubts started to form in my head. In the privacy of my damp, tiny bathroom apartment on Danforth Street, staring at the bathroom mirror, I searched for a clue. It must be my Middle Eastern look, I said to myself. So I shaved off my mustache. In years to follow, I would shed layers of my cultural coverings, consciously or not, and become wary of my accent and hide my true feelings, all in order to fit in. I told myself this was going to be home, irrespective of my discomforts and loneliness. And then finally we'll come to the final part in this book. Well, maybe read 2 more paragraphs perhaps. I felt and acted invisible as I tiptoed through crowds in streets, malls, fairs, cinemas, unseen and unspoken to, like a ghost. During holidays I felt homesick and lonely. I could not try as I might share in the joy of the loud laughter and the celebration that went around me. During one New Year's Eve's celebration, as I stood watching the fireworks explode overhead in the black December sky, my toes freezing in my cheap boots, I realized I knew nobody in the large crowd gathered to welcome the arrival of another year. As the crowd screamed every time the sky glittered with millions of tiny, colorful sparks, it dawned on me that I was alone in a city of thousands and in a country of millions. I rushed home feeling terrified. During such darker times, inside my apartment, I faced ghosts who would show up uninvited to remind me of time I had spent in Indian police station and jails for my peaceful political activities opposing the Iranian government, and of friends and classmates who had died in Iranian prisons. Finally, but it was in the same Maine that I witnessed again and again the grace, the kindness, and the generosity for which most Americans and Mainers are known. Most often such kindness would wrap itself around me the way the morning fog embraced the islands of Casco Bay in wintertime. On the day I arrived at the airport in Portland, Sam and Sandy offered to take me to their home in Cape Elizabeth. Years later, when Sandy was diagnosed with cancer at the same time as one of my sisters living in Iran was, I found myself praying for them both. 2 sisters living in 2 different wards. Sandy survived the illness. My sister Puran did not. Thank you. And so, I would like to say a few words about my other book, Homesick, Mosque, the collection of short stories, which came out a year ago. And this book, it really came out of this need to tell the stories of Muslim immigrants in the United States in the post-9/11 America. The 9/11 tragedy not only shattered the sense of security that Americans had, not only changed the way the life for us and made us become more cynical, perhaps, and unsafe, but it also changed the lives of Muslim immigrants and immigrants in general for good. Before 9/11, Muslim Americans felt as part of America, as part of the magic we call America, this gorgeous symphony we call America. And overnight, they found themselves to be looked at with suspicious, that they became the public enemy number one, that America was no longer home for some of them. In particular for those from the Middle East, the life changed because now simple acts such as going to a mosque in a small town in New England became a risky business. You were followed around, you were pulled out of lines at airports because of your last name, because of your looks, because people suspected you were a Muslim. You were denied jobs and housing. You were called names. In other words, home became this foreign place, reminding the newcomers of a past that they had left behind. A past where we were suspected of disloyalty to the state, we were denied employment because of that. And that, it brought back, again, those dark nightmares of the past that we all have thought we'd left behind. Intolerance and jingoism, like the two hungry snakes, one on each shoulder of a fabled king in ancient Persia. Taha. It's an older story in Persian literature of this king who was dying to become a king, and Satan offered to help him to become a king in exchange for getting the chance to kiss him on two shoulders, and the king agreed. The day the king reached the crown, Satan appeared and said, well, we had a promise, you remember? You promised that I'll get a chance to kiss your shoulders. And the king thought, what can possibly go wrong? And two snakes grew on each shoulder, the spots where Satan had kissed the king. And now all the doctors in the world came and explained to the king that the only way that the king would not be harmed by the snakes if the brains of the young men from his land were fed to the snakes on a daily basis. This is really, in many ways, this is a story of some of even the modern contemporary dictators in the Middle East, Saddam Hussein, the Shah of Iran, the mullahs in Iran, that how the young people in these lands seem to be the victims. So in many ways that story, even though it was written some thousands of years ago, is still applicable to today. So intolerance and jingoism in this country grew like these two snakes, one on each shoulder. In a matter of days, a peaceful, law-abiding immigrants whose only crime was to worship the same God as the group of criminals, the hijackers, became the public enemy. Friendships came to an end. Muslim children, innocent of the war's cruelty, were called names in the schools, playgrounds, and hallways. Some including non-Muslim citizens who looked Middle Eastern, were murdered. A Sikh, an Indian Sikh, that's a religion in India, who were determined as part of the religious practice, were mistaken for Muslims and were murdered. 2 Egyptian Christians were murdered in the southern part of this country. So it wasn't only the Muslims. Now, anyone who looked Middle Eastern or remotely looked like a Muslim were at risk. Back then, my wife and I lived in a suburb outside of Portland, and I had coached the soccer team where our children were playing, young kids. And as such, we enjoyed good friendship with many of our neighbors. And I remember the Sunday after 9/11, we went to the field to play soccer. That many of those families, if not most, did not sit with us. They moved their chairs away. And it broke my heart because I had not done anything wrong. I just happened to belong to the same faith as this criminal who claimed that they committed this crime in the name of God. And yet I was denied their friendship. Consumed by fear, most of us started to look at our neighbors differently. Fear became the currency of the day. Fear not only makes you crawl to a corner and say nothing, but it kills reason, it kills hope, it kills imagination. It also makes you be careless with words. You start calling people names. You become okay with your government torturing people. You become okay with the state kidnapping even innocents. That's what fear does to you. In case of most immigrants, fear silenced them. It made them invisible in their new country. But for me, reading and writing fiction became my surrogate home in an otherwise fearsome state of displacement and not belonging. I really found refuge in books, in art. Art always really tames the savages inside us. Music does that, poetry does that, any form of art, including literature. And for me, writing and reading became really the only way that I could deal with this insanity and darkness around us back then. And so I started to write fiction. I started to create characters in these books. With the 6 stories in this book, with the exception of one story deals with the loneliness of this elderly person, an immigrant from Iran, an elderly woman who moves to Santa Monica in California to be closer to her daughter. And then she's so lonely because the daughter is, of course, now American. She works all the time. And the mother came thinking that they would spend a lot of time together, they would go and watch plays, they would go and shop together. But the daughter is busy. She has a life of her own, so she becomes delusional. She now starts seeing the ghost of her past, and now all that. So with the exception of that story, the other 5 stories are about immigrants, Muslim immigrants, and even one non-Muslim, who really feel invisible, marginalized in this new time and in a new environment. So my characters in general experienced the loneliness of life spent in exile, the yearning for home. And my stories speak to the reconstruction of the memory and identity, and the fact that the poets and writers have always been charged with that mission, and sometimes very dangerous and risky in some countries. I've lost cousins, close friends who, because of the poetry and writing, sit in prisons in Iran as we speak. So I'm fortunate to live in a country where I can write and without the fear of the secret police. But writing is a dangerous business, but you write so that you really you record what's going on, you keep record of what's going on in your town and in the world, all that darkness, and because really the struggle of us against power, the state power, is the struggle of memory against forgetting. And so I take, as you can imagine, I take my task very, very seriously. And these stories are really important to me because 20 years from now, 30 years from now, we may or may not forget about that life in the post-9/11 America, that we all are still continue to be forced to remove our shoes and go through more security lines, and some of it, I'm glad they're out there. We all need to feel safe, but some of them I feel might be unnecessary. But we may forget about this, but it's really important that we write about them so generations from now know what happened. I'm going to read from one of the short stories. It's about a Pakistani gentleman. The story is called Baba Be Careful. Baba in many languages means father. And Baba Be Careful. And the story of this Pakistani retired faculty member who teaches used to teach at a school in New England, and he goes out to buy a used car. And he buys a used car, and the used car comes with a sticker which says something about the war. And his friendship with his close neighbor becomes a casualty because of that sticker on his car, which is opposing the war. So I start where he's going to buy a used car, and he has a conversation with his wife. Why bother with a used car? Go out and buy a new Honda. Taj is his wife. Taj advised him last night. He's envious of her ability, a gift he was not born with, to meet life's challenges with ease and adjust to changes around her. Mr. Abdul finds it odd that his wife somehow, still a mystery how, manages to behave as a carefree Westerner in public, but lives the life of a content Pakistani housewife in private. Furthermore, he feels annoyed that she could handle the war news. This is the war in Iraq, which would make him brood for endless hours to come, with the same ease as selecting ripe mangoes that she picks at the local Vietnamese food store. The same night as they watched the evening news packed with coverage of the war that was going badly for all sides, he was outraged with images of dying children lying on bare metal beds in hospitals with walls stained with blood was shown. We are responsible for this slaughter, he murmured. She sat there calm as a cow, chewing on spiced almonds and gazing at him with her large brown eyes. Collateral damage, caught at the wrong place at the wrong time, happens in every war, she said in a casual tone, oblivious to her husband's misery. In recent months, she had started to wear a stamp-sized flag pinned to her large bosom when at work. Bank's new policy, as a staff, we wear them to show our respect for the troops fighting overseas. She said the first time Mr. Abdul asked her about it. Mr. Abdul is the husband, the Pakistani gentleman. And so he buys the car, and his friendship with the neighbor, Mrs. Bernstein, is at risk. So we go to where his wife Taj would mention to Mr. Abdul that the neighbor is unhappy. And well, before that, he comes home and tells Taj that he just saw the neighbor in a rally, in a pro-war rally in downtown, and the same neighbor, Mrs. Bernstein. Once home, Mr. Abdul tells Taj that he saw Mrs. Bernstein attending a rally. What rally? First tell me how much you paid for the car, Taj asked, carrying a tray holding a glass of cold water and a bowl filled with sliced mangoes. Not waiting for an answer, she tears open the plastic bag containing the large flag. "Who gave this to you?" she asked. "Can you hang it outside the way Mrs. Bernstein has done?" "We will see," the husband says, with a mouthful of mango, a yellowish juice dripping down his chin. "I hope you did not pay too much for it," Taj says, looking at the car parked in the driveway. Unlike most of the neighbors in the subdivision, Mrs. Bernstein was a friendly one. She took Taj and her family under her wings from the time they moved to the two-story colonial. She treated Taj like a family member, to the extent that Taj, while talking about her, a fellow neighbor in work, referred to Mrs. Bernstein as her American sister. They watched over each other's children till they graduated from high school, went to college, and settled down in different parts of the country. During Eid celebration at the end of Ramadan, Mrs. Bernstein and her husband were invited to elaborate Pakistani dinners prepared by Taj. In return, every Thanksgiving, the Bernsteins would invite them to their large and comfortable home, treating them to a traditional turkey dinner. On such occasions, Taj would cook chicken curry and rice, a favorite of Mrs. Bernstein, to bring as a contribution. And then Mr. Bernstein dies, and the two become closer and very, very good friends. And Mr. Abdul is also likes spending time with Mrs. Bernstein. For his part, Mr. Abdul enjoyed Mrs. Bernstein's company. They discussed politics, international affairs in particular, since Mrs. Bernstein had a passion for world affairs. A loyal listener to the National Public Radio, she stayed informed about the events in the Middle East. Years before, when parts of Pakistan were shaken by a powerful earthquake, she came to ask if the families were okay. She offered to collect blankets and baby food for the victims. However, all that changed once the towers in New York came down on a beautiful fall day in 2011. Overnight, her grief over the loss of lives and destruction of property turned into resentment for everything Islamic. Despite her liberal views on most matters, she became a Muslim hater, who starting with assuring Taj and her husband that her new viewpoint did not include them, as she saw them as modern Muslims, spoke passionately of the danger that Islam, the backward faith of bearded men and bent on killing non-Muslims, according to her, posed to the civilized West. She believed the threat, evil and foreign, had to be met with maximum force. "We have to teach them how to behave in a modern world," she said to Taj once in presence of Mr. Abdul, who almost opened his mouth to say something in response, but saw Taj's pleading eyes and went back to reading War and Peace. Over time, to Mr. Abdul's disbelief, she went from the person who felt sad when hearing of a child dying of AIDS in South Africa to a war-mongering elfin, monster, convinced of the need for the shock and awe strategy promoted by the administration to bring fear to the hearts of every Muslim, young and old. Right after the invasion of Iraq, Mrs. Bernstein came to ask Taj to help her to tie yellow ribbons on every tree and the utility poles in the neighborhood, starting with the leafing oaks in front of the Abdul's house. Mr. Abdul was secretly overjoyed when Taj refused to get involved. Since high school, when my best friend was taken to a Karachi police station and was never seen or heard of, "I hate politics of every kind," Taj said with her husband looking up. "How barbaric! She must have refused to wear the veil," Mrs. Bernstein asked with a look of disgust. "What veil? What are you talking about? Never mind a veil, she was a communist, a Mao sympathizer." "What? While in high school you had a communist for a friend, Mr. Bernstein said. That was a long time ago. Back then, most young people were lefties, but not me, Taj said. In months to follow, Mrs. Bernstein started neighborhood drives to collect stuff that troops in Iraq might be in need of. Chewing gum, eminent, magazines, and DVDs. She wore shirts decorated with stars and stripes and went door to door to ask for donations. Mr. Abdul, though unhappy with the war in Iraq, gave her a box of hard candies he had bought at CVS for this purpose. A local TV station ran a story to praise her patriotic efforts. Taj was excited to see her friend on television. I should call and tell her she looked good on TV, Taj said. Mr. Abdul frowned and hushed Taj, since he wanted to hear what Mrs. Bernstein was saying to the camera. We have to stand united to support our troops, our men and women in uniform who are fighting Islamic evil, she said, her steely blue eyes staring at the camera, as if publicly challenging Mr. Abdul's sense of loyalty to the post-9/11 America. So finally, he decides to go and visit her to see if they can get over this conflict. And but before that, Taj advises him to do that. It takes Taj 2 days to mention her conversation with Mrs. Bernstein. She said to tell you she was disappointed to see the anti-war sticker. Taj says with a gloomy look in her round face, as if delivering a teacher's remarks to a misbehaving kid. Can't you remove it with hot water and soap? Taj asked. Why should I do that? This is a free country, Mr. Abdul says, ignoring his wife's accusing eyes. Nobody's forcing her to look at it. Calm down, Baba. So what if she's for the war and you're not? In the banking world, we call that agreeing to disagree. Taj says, go tell her it came with the vehicle. So he decides to do that. A week later, Mr. Abdul stands at Mrs. Bernstein's doorsteps and admires the flowering petunias, pots, one on each side, sitting on the red brick stoop, guarding the door. He feels uneasy as he rings the doorbell. She opens the door and stares at him with a wave of her thin arm. She asks him in. The gold ring on her parted fingers glint in the light that seeps through the large window over the door. They greet each other and ask about their respective adult children. Mr. Abdul feels apprehensive with what might come next as he sits on the sofa edge. The thick Persian carpets feels spongy under his polished shoes. She sits across from him asking about Taj. Does she like your new car? Mrs. Bernstein asked. I think she does. It actually is a used one, but it's new to me, he says. I see, she says, and fidgets on her Queen Anne chair. She offers to bring coffee and returns with a silver tray holding 2 mugs and a slice of pie for Mr. Abdul. Yesterday I saw you at the rally in downtown. It looked well attended, Mr. Abdul says. It was okay. All of us need to do more to support our boys and girls fighting over there, she says. She crosses her legs. Mr. Abdul nods and raises the mug to his lips, inhaling the steam rising out of it. As a tea drinker, he enjoys his occasional cups of coffee. Mrs. Bernstein opens her thin mouth, and her words erupt like bullets, catching her neighbor off guard. Mr. Abdul, how come you aren't supporting our soldiers? I feel disappointed in you, she says. Imagine advertising your opposition to the war in public. You know such actions will only comfort our Muslim enemies. She stops to catch her breath. As he rests the mug down on a coaster, trying hard to calm his trembling hand, Mr. Abdul searches his mind desperately to say the right thing in response. According to Mahatma Gandhi, violence begets more violence, he sobs, but watches with concern as his elderly neighbor inhales and exhales rapidly as if in urgent need of air. Mr. Abdul stops, staring at her. She looks like a beached bass, struggling to stay alive. But you don't understand, she says. The fish in need of water cuts in. We did not want a war. We were attacked savagely in our cities. What would your Mahatma Gandhi say to that? Mr. Abdul stares at the season of peace printed on the side of the mug on the table. The blueberry pie remains untouched. He would like to say something smart, such as, war is a sanctioned form of mass murder, but cannot focus. Mrs. Bernstein, on the other hand, seems to have no difficulty remembering her lines. In this country, we expected to support our soldiers in time of war. We leave the rest to our leaders, she says. Some in the house, a telephone rings. Mr. Abdul hopes to be excused to leave should she decide to answer it. But she ignores the ringing phone and sits looking solemn. He finds a loose thread on his shirt sleeve and pulls it free. He hears the tick-tock of the gilded clock on a table. In no time, the silence sits between them, unyielding like a third person. I have to ask you this. Why aren't you more grateful? Mrs. Bernstein asks. Mr. Abdul feels confused. You mean for our friendship? For being an immigrant? We let you come here to live among us, to be an American. Mr. Abdul takes a deep breath. He does not know where to begin. He feels his heart beating hard against his chest. He opens his mouth for more air and starts to say something only to stop to think. Madam, I gave this country my youth, my life, and more importantly, my 2 children. What else do I have to do to prove my gratitude? Mr. Abdul says, pausing to catch his breath. He has more to say. But the look on his neighbor's face tells him he has said enough. Do you want to learn how homesick I feel at times? My sense of loss for missing my nephews and nieces' births, marriages, my private grief over my absence to witness the aging of my parents, and the occasional regret for having spent a whole life spent as an outsider. Mr. Abdul wonders. I thought someone like you would appreciate that freedom does not come cheaply. Mrs. Bernstein is ruthless. Mr. Abdul almost opens his mouth to ask how would his, or for that matter, her or everyone else's freedom has anything to do with the conflict in Iraq. Instead, he murmurs a few words to thank her for the coffee and stands up to leave. As he passes through the familiar parlor, feeling heartbroken, he wonders if he and Taj would ever be asked to spend a Thanksgiving dinner there. His neighbor keeps herself busy by picking out the crops while waving goodbye. Thank you. How are we doing with time?
Well, I think it would be wonderful if we could open it up to some questions.
Absolutely,
I'm sure people
absolutely.
have things that
Please.
they might like to ask.
Please.
Yes, I remember in the early part of your talk, you mentioned in your apartment on Danforth, shaving your beard and trying to look more like an American, as I take it.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could comment on the tension that immigrants must feel as they decide what to wear every day. Do they follow the pressures of their religion and wear the might have the term burqas and veils and things, or do they shed them to try to look more like the people they see in the street?
You all had the question. I think it's a generational issue. The younger the immigrants are, or the ones who are born here or came at an early age, seem to have an easier time to integrate and become Americans, which in itself then causes tension between the two generations. The parents try desperately to hang on to the older world, and by insisting that the children should look, behave, act as people back home, and of course children don't want to do that. So it's really an issue of age. The younger you are, you're likely to keep changing in terms of what you wear, how you behave, learning the English faster, and becoming an American. And in most cases, the older you are, it's much harder. So we see that tension as we work with immigrants in Maine, that again, there's this growing divide. For example, the Cambodians, the parents are shocked at how the children are leaving Buddhism way of life behind, that they are, the younger girls are getting pregnant before getting married and wanting to act and behave as a teenager in this country. It's tempting, it's seducing. Who wants to go the old way, which is very boring and requires a lot of patience, that wait, you'll get married when the time comes. And so we see that. I mean, again, it varies from one community to another. When the earlier groups of immigrants came to Maine, and by earlier I mean when I was here, those were from the former Soviet Union, from the Eastern Europe, and they didn't really have to change much. For one, they were mostly Christians, or wanted to be Christian because they could not practice Christianity when they were part of the Soviet Union. And they really did quite well in terms of becoming American. It's much harder for a person coming from a village in Sudan. Then you also have the whole issue of that you need to dress warm in Maine. So that kind of, that really dictates a lot of, I mean, forget about those colorful, wonderful cotton African dresses, that just won't go, you don't do well with those events.
Could you say more about Islam in Maine? I, as a relative new Englander myself, coming from England by Massachusetts, I wasn't even aware that there was a Somali community in Lewiston, and I've never been to Lewiston. And I'm wondering also whether or not, I think most Americans have got over their Islamophobia following 2001, but with the news that's happening now about the murder of even Muslims as well as Christians and Jews who aren't part of the Islamic State, whether or not there is still an obstacle about Islam per se in lives of many people, not just in Maine, but
Well, Maine continues to be a very, very tolerant and accepting state when it comes to people belonging to different faiths. And this has been part of Maine's history. In fact, 100 years ago, there were members of religious sects and groups within Christianity or non-Christian who were persecuted in other parts of the country. In the US would come to Maine because in Maine, basically, if you don't bother people, they leave you alone. Because this is a thing about Maine that just don't tell me what to do and you're fine. You can do whatever you want. So in Maine, we've been fortunate as Muslims. We really haven't seen that level of animosity and hostility I was in a meeting, to give you an example, I was in a meeting with the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Maine received a huge grant, the Maine Humanities Council received a huge grant from the National Humanities Endowment for Humanities to create workshops about Islam. So I've been to some 15 libraries across the state, and the chairman Adams had this question for me. Any disrespectful questions, any pushback, did the libraries receive hate mail? And he was pleased when I told him, no. That's not the news in other parts of the country. In other parts of the country, schools, universities, libraries had to disinvite Muslim speakers because the community said, these are Satan worshippers, these are devil worshippers, never mind that Islam is an Abrahamic religion and they believe in the same God as Christians and Jews. So that's a longer conversation to talk about how much Islam has in common with Christianity and Judaism. It's a different conversation that how Islam has been part of the American narrative for centuries. The first Muslim arrived here in the 14th century in this land. A Mali explorer who was a Muslim, and then with Christopher Columbus, Muslims arrived as his captains, his bookkeepers, and Jewish, by the way. And that part of the history is somehow missing, that there were Jewish and Muslim bookkeepers, navigators, and people who basically helped Christopher Columbus find or lose his way, depending on your politics. And so that's a different conversation, that Muslims have been 1/4 of the slaves brought to this country were Muslims. But Muslims in Maine, it is amazing. We have 7 to 9 mosques in Maine. I'm writing a book, so I'm doing some research for that book, and I'm amazed at how welcoming and accepting some of these communities have been. When in Augusta, Muslims in Augusta wanted to start a mosque, when they went to the town hall meeting, the planning committee meeting, we are all expecting opposition from the neighbors, not a single one. I mean, the town's rabbi came out in support of the mosque. How gorgeous is that? And so we have 4 mosques in Portland alone, 4 or 5, 2 in Lewiston, 1 in Augusta, 1 in Orono. And so, in addition to some 20, 30 Muslim student associations with the Bowdoin, UMO, USM, Colby, and other schools and high schools. So there's some estimate that in 5 years Islam will become the 2nd largest religion in the United States, and that would be the case in Maine. And I'm not surprised because again we see more and more immigrants coming to Maine, and some of the Muslims have lived in Maine for a long time, African American Muslims. We tend to forget.
But if like you said, Somalis are Muslims.
Yes, Somalis are
And I
Muslims.
think until recently, most Americans were ignorant of the fact that large parts of Africa are Muslim as well. And I'm wondering if their cultural and religious background poses more of an obstacle to their being integrated, as well as the color of their skin, than other Muslims in Maine.
Absolutely. To quote my students, my immigrant students at the University of Southern Maine, the Somali students tell me that they have 2 barriers to overcome: the skin of color and the faith. So they are persecuted twice, if that's possible, because they're also black in an otherwise very white state, and they also happen to belong to a religion that some of us know very little about, and we suspect them of not being loyal to this country. Never mind that again, that Islam has been present in this land. Prior to establishment of the Republic, Islam was part of the narrative. Muslims fought in the revolutionary cause. How many of us know about that in this room? That Muslims fought in the revolutionary cause. They fought for freedom. They fought that the United States become a reality. Or, I'll say this and then we move to the next question. Or the first country in the world which recognized the new republic was a Muslim country. when the United States was born, Morocco was the first country which not only recognized, most countries feared backlash from England, remember? England is the superpower back then. The United States of America is a young nation, very vulnerable. Morocco was the first country, extended a hand of friendship. They
It
felt
was a
that
French
they were-
colony at the time.